Just too far in?
Well, because like if I do want to work at a beer company ever, I'm gonna need that diploma.
I'm just too far in now.
That's what I tell them. Oh, I'm stuck now. They know me.
Seriously. Let's see.
But I know there's actually a lot of studies on why students go to college now.
Mm-hmm.
Is it really important? Is it necessary? And we'll eventually switch over because if everybody goes to college, it's not really worth anything to somebody.
Well, I mean, I think it's already become that to an extent.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that in industry, a bachelor's degree used to be significantly more respected than it is today.
Yeah.
I think today, the master's degree is looked at as what the bachelor's degree used to be looked at.
I think it's even going closer to doctorates.
I would say maybe doctorates haven't necessarily changed because a doctorate doesn't necessarily make you more qualified for a lot of jobs because it's such a different degree.
Yeah.
So in some ways, doctorates actually play you out of a lot of industry jobs if for no other reason than pay grade.
Yeah.
Where somebody who has a master's is every bit as capable of doing a specific job as somebody with a PhD because the PhD isn't. It's a different kind of degree. It's not a do degree, it's a theory degree. So, but I would say that it's the master's that sets people apart now than the bachelor's because everybody has a bachelor's. The bachelor's is our new high school diploma or something like that. Just become kind of stupid, I guess. I don't know. Let's see. Last time we were talking about... We're on this slide, minimalistic stuff. I think we were looking at a Hello World program in assembly, what that kind of looks like, what are the things that went into it, how interrupts worked. So we were talking about the magic tricks that a CPU needs to be able to do. So we said we need to be able to move crap from one place to another. These places are typically called registers. So let's talk about storage. So these old-time computers dealing with storage, how would we store things? What are our options? Well, with CPUs today, we think about storage as these hardware registers. So a hardware register is basically a hardware variable. And our modern assembly languages usually support, let's see, 4, 8, I would say a minimum of 8 hardware registers, and then another 8, probably 8 16-bit registers, 4 32-bit registers, or maybe it's 8 32, 4 64, and then another 8 16s, half registers. It repurposes them. But a group of hardware-based storage that is memory. Well, again, these are dealt with. These are done in terms of integrated circuits. What did we do before we had transistors and the advent of integrated circuits? Where now we're back to this whole vacuum tube type of thing in a gymnasium or thing in a large room. How did we store things? What were the earlier forms of medium for storing things? If you go buy music today, what does it come on? Okay, now it's digital, right? Who buys music? I've never bought music. Well, so let's go back as far as I remember.
Oh gosh.
So if we're talking about music,
8-track?
started off as 8-track. Then it was cassette tape. Did I spell it right? Cassette tape. Both of these are based on magnetic tape. That's how things were stored. Similar thing to VCRs, VHS for video, Beta for video. Before that, actually, so these are based on magnetic tape. What came before magnetic tape? What did we do before 8-track? We had a record. So a record was a physical media with grooves. And what happened is the needle thing, it wiggled against the grooves, and the sound was amplified, and it turned into actual music that you heard. It was literally a physical representation of music. 8-track was a digital representation of music, still analog. We really are talking about two separate things. Digital storage, but still analog processing. So, in any case, we went from a record to 8-track to cassette tape. Then what? CD. They started doing some music on DVDs. That didn't really take off. That was kind of in a transition where the idea was CDs were high quality, but we had some newer technologies to record music at even a higher quality rating. And in order for it to fit, it needed to go into a higher format. CDs natively store music as WAV format, which is uncompressed raw data. A DVD would have stored as a WAV format as well, but just more raw data, kind of high definition music, if you will. Today, most of our music is done in MP3s, right? Digital format, completely digital, no physical medium whatsoever. Which is higher quality, a CD or an MP3? CD is actually the higher quality because it's stored uncompressed. Stored uncompressed. MP3 is a compressed format. Now, is compression necessarily lower quality than uncompressed? In terms of moving data around, does it necessarily mean that something is lower quality if it's compressed? Well, just because you can't hear it doesn't mean it isn't lower or higher quality. Kind of like just because you don't see the dirt under the couch in the living room and it's like must be clean. Must be. What do you mean? That's where I keep my pizza. So from a computation perspective, does the idea of compression actually lower the quality? Well, we've downloaded things off the web. They usually come in a zip folder, right? So that's compressed. Is the quality of the software worse because it was compressed? What does compression cost us? Music, you'll have people who argue that a uncompressed format is a lossless format, where a compressed form of music is lossy from the perspective that it needs to be rebuilt and something may have been lost in the translation. But when we think about zipping up, Eclipse or something like that, some software package we download off the web, is it acceptable for anything to be lost in translation, or does it all need to be there after we unzip it? It had to make it through the journey, right? It all has to be there. So we would hope that the same thing is true for music. So what's the advantage of compression? Start with that. Store more or store the same amount in a smaller spot, right? Makes it easier to transmit over the internet. So the whole reason compression even exists is because of transmission speeds. Even back when you had things locally, if the transmission speed between one device and another device was slow, getting the data to the faster device more quickly was beneficial. So we use compression. What's the downside of compression? If I'm making this argument against the downside being a quality problem, what is the downside of compression?
You lose some data.
Okay, but I'm arguing you won't lose data. I don't believe in this whole lossless versus lossy type thing. Bits are bits, whether a bit was lost and rebuilt. If it was a 1 before and it's a 1 now, it's fine. Nothing's actually been lost. Audiophiles would maybe disagree but they're disagreeing on a different level. Something we'll talk about in a second. I'm just seeing if I can drag it out of you first. So what's the disadvantage of compression? Would you agree that that as we move forward, things seem to be getting more and more compressed? Whether we're necessarily aware of it or not, compression is almost something that we just take for granted today, correct? Historically, it was like I remember with floppy disks, you could actually put a compressed format on the disk. So instead of it being 1.44 megabytes that you could store on a floppy disk, you could actually get it up to 2.96 megabytes or something like that. But it was a lot slower. Hint, hint. Why? Performance. Why is the performance worse for compression? Has to decompress it. In order to use compressed stuff, we have to decompress it. Because when it's stored in a compressed format, it's stored in a simplified, an abstracted, a whatever. It's stored in such a way that it can be rebuilt. But in its current state, it's not complete. At least that's a generalistic way of looking at it. So how do we decompress things? Well, when you download a file off the internet, you download Eclipse and it's zipped up. We download it, gets on our desktop, anymore we can just double click on it and it decompresses for us using the default program, or you right click and you say, uncompress or unzip or whatever, and it goes through the 10-second process or whatever and decompresses it, right? Okay, so then you're left with a folder that's hopefully your original. Okay, you've unboxed the package, if you will. What about music? When you download an MP3 and you double click on it, you expect it to immediately start playing, don't you? MP3 is a compressed format. And in order to play that compressed format, it must be decompressed. So we have to decompress in real time. Well, decompressing in real time is a performance issue. It's going to be CPU intensive, right? So we either have to use our generalistic CPU, and the way we teach a CPU to decompress MP3 is through software. So you have a piece of software that knows how to convert MP3 to WAV, and you stream MP3 bits to it, and it, in real time, converts it to WAV output and sends it to the graphics card. This will be built into iTunes or Windows Media Player. And who's doing the heavy lifting? The CPU is doing the heavy lifting. Okay? Now, realistically, there are sound cards, sound boards, that could do the same thing at the hardware level. The idea that would be higher performance. It's a physical circuit specifically built for decompressing MP3. That make sense? So, now there's a whole bunch of different compression formats, correct? Even with music. Isn't there, you have MP3, ACC, what are some other music formats?
MP4.
MP4 would be a video format. Isn't there an OOG? There's an OGG. There's an OGG audio format. So just take those three. But there's 7 or 8 different random audio formats floating around out there. There's the video equivalent of this. We probably see it more at the video equivalent because pretty much for audio, MP3's become the standard, right? But for video, it's a little bit more up in the air. We have MP4, we have an MP4 encoded H.264, which is a higher quality. It's a higher compression rate actually. We have AVI, we have MKV, XVID. DivX has kind of gone away, hasn't it? Yeah, DivX was popular for about a year or so, and that seemed to get supplanted by maybe XVids. But in any case, we have a bunch of different video formats as well, which are different encodings, and usually when something's called an encoding, it's also a compression. It's you're compressing it as well. You're storing it in a smaller footprint. So you need to have some way of in real time decoding that, because downloading a file off the internet and unzipping it gives a human being a different expectation than listening to music or watching a video. We're not willing to sit there and uncompress our video ahead of time, because that would actually take a lot of time. Video and audio are highly, highly compressed. And what's actually interesting there, have any of you ever played, like through iMovie or one of the different video manipulation software suites, have you ever tried to play uncompressed video? So let's say you have a video camera, a 1080p video camera, and let's say that it allows you to store the data as a .raw file, a raw video file. Okay, so a raw video file would literally be kind of what we've been talking about. We had one of the slides that was talking about high definition TV or whatever. Where we had the 1920 by 1080. And it's at 60 frames a second. How many? What's the size of that? Big number of gigabytes, right? Let's just do that real quick. It'll only take a second. So 1920 times 1080 is the number of pixels on an individual screen times 60 per second times 60 for an hour, let's say. Then each of those we're going to say is 24-bit color. So divided by 8, divided by 1024, divided by 1024, divided by 1024. I think I actually hit an extra button there. 1920 by 1080. Times 60 times 60, that's an hour, divided by 8. That's bytes, divided by 1024. That's kilobytes, divided by 1024. Oh, I didn't do the 24 bits, yeah. 1920, 1080, times 60 per second, times 60 for an hour, times 24 bits, divided by 8 is bytes, divided by 1024 is kilobytes, divided by 1024 is megabytes, divided by 1024 is gigabytes. So an hour worth of uncompressed high definition video is 20.8 gigabytes. It's a 20.8 gigabyte file. So that's for an hour. Now, if you've ever downloaded a hour-long TV show, let's say, so if you divide this by 60, that's 0.35 gigabytes per second, or per minute rather, per minute. So times, let's just do a 90-minute movie. So now we're at 31.3 gigabytes. So your typical hour-and-a-half movie that you would download in XVID or something like that might be, the higher definition ones might be 2 gigabytes, 3 gigabytes maybe, something like that. Okay, so 10 times smaller in a compressed format than in a raw format. Now, 31 gigabytes, and let's divide this by 90 again. So a third of a gigabyte every single second needs to be able to be decoded, sent to your graphics card to be spit out to the screen to watch high definition raw video. That's actually a lot of data moving in a very short period of time. How many of you have ever tried to copy a 1 gigabyte file from your desktop to a USB drive or something like that? Yeah, it takes a couple minutes or something, right? Something along those lines. Well, we're talking about a third of that needing to be processed every single 1 second. And that's the amount of data we're dealing with. Now that data needs to be processed. That is, split it up into all the pixels that are on the screen, into the 24 bits of color for each of those pixels, and actually show the color every single second. And actually, it's happening every 60th of a second, because it's happening 60 times per second. So we can further divide this by 60, and we're dealing with 0.006 gigabytes every 60th of a second is the amount of data we have flying around. So multiply that by 1,024. That's 6 megabytes per 60th of a second that our machine has to process. So our graphics card has to do that, whatever. So the point of this is I was asking if any of you have ever tried to watch raw video and our machines can't keep up with it. Probably only a very specifically built machine could you actually sit there and watch an 1.5 hour movie of raw video. There would be too much lag otherwise. The audio would get all off, the video would be super choppy because it can't keep up. This whole idea of 60 frames a second, it becomes this idea for those of you who are PC gamers. Earlier in the semester we talked about graphics cards. And why does somebody go out and buy the $600 graphics card rather than the $100 graphics card? If the human eye can only actually detect about 40 frames a second, and both of those guys can run the game at a minimum of 70 frames a second, but the $600 one can get up to 600 frames a second. No, the idea is not for your average case; it's for the worst case. The $600 graphics card, when you get into an area of the game that's super, super intensive, it drops to 140 frames a second. Way more than the human eye could detect. But your cheaper graphics card that can usually do 140 frames a second drops to 12 frames a second. Now you're noticing because it's bogged down. So you'd rather have the power and not need it than need it and not have it type thing. Well, this is even worse. The amount of data we're talking about, even being local. Say local. The size of this video was what, 20 gigs for an 1.5 hour movie? Just recently, in the last couple of years, could we even fit that entire movie into RAM? Right? 20 gigabytes was a ridiculous amount of memory not that long ago. It's still a pretty ridiculous amount of memory. If you went out and got a laptop today or at a desktop today, 8 gigabytes is probably what a reasonable person should get if they were going to keep this machine for 2 or 3 years, something like that. If it was a highly integrated machine that's not easily upgradable and you had the choice to go to 16, I could see you making that jump because it's not overly expensive to do it, but really 16's overkill. I have this laptop, I'm pretty sure, has 16 gigs. Yeah, so this has 16 gigabytes of RAM in it. Do I need 16 gigabytes of RAM in a laptop? I'm not going to use it. But even this, I can't fit that 20 gigabyte 1.5 hour movie of RAW into memory. So that means, at least in part, I'm going to be streaming that off of hard drive. And this thing has a super fast solid state drive in it, fine. Is that still slower than RAM? Absolutely. And is RAM as fast as our registers? Not even close. The closer and closer and closer you get to the CPU, the faster things get. So, we're trying to paint this picture that, okay, well now I have to be able to handle 6 megabytes every 60th of a second. And I don't have highways in my computer that can transmit data at that speed. Compression's my only option. Correct? We see this in the cable industry all the time. I think I mentioned one other time about if you have Time Warner Cable or something with high definition channels, which aren't 1080p. They're 1080i at best, 1368 by 768. So it's a smaller number of pixels anyways. They have to compress the heck out of that. And then intertwine that with probably maybe 8 other channels at an individual period of time before they've maxed their bandwidth. Before Time Warner can't show more than 8 simultaneous high definition channels inside the same neighborhood. Sure, they offer 40, but they're crossing their fingers and hoping that people aren't watching more than 8. I'm just throwing numbers out there, but they're not ridiculously far off, those numbers. It's a weakness of an older network. The coaxial network that the cable companies are using kind of hybridized with a fiber optic network, which they've added over the years, can only handle so much bandwidth. We think of it as it's a local area network and it's super fast and all this stuff. It's infinite. Infinite's in the eye of the beholder, and as our data keeps getting bigger and bigger, infinite keeps getting smaller and smaller. The reality is those pipelines can maybe move data at 3, 4, 5 gigabits per second, something like that. Even if it's 100 gigabit per second. If you're transferring 20 gigabytes per hour across multiple stations, it starts adding up, right? Pretty quickly. So we're not even talking about something as large as a cable provider. We're talking about in our apartment, in our house, having a 20 gigabyte raw, high definition hour-and-a-half movie stored on our hard drive and watching it on the screen of that same computer. No network. Everything's local. And I'm telling you, our computers today would have trouble keeping up with that. It would be choppy at best. Who works with raw format? Video editors who are walking through stuff one frame at a time. Things like that. They're not watching that movie raw. How many of you have ever done video editing stuff at any sort of even minor level using iMovie or something like that? So, did you ever work with raw video, or were you always working with compressed? Okay. But then in the end, so you were working with compressed, but you were actually leveraging software. Because in the end, once you were done with your thing, you had to export your project, which basically compressed it into its real format. So you were working with it in a compressed format, but your software and hard drive and hardware were decompressing it when you made changes. So you were making changes in individual frames. It maybe didn't look like that to you, but that was the software. You were leveraging software to do it. But at the end of the day, you were having to recompress that. How long were the things you were editing?
Not that long, they're like 5 minutes.
Okay, so like a 5-minute video. What kind of machine were you on for, what kind of computer were you on doing this?
Just a simple PC, like i3 processor.
Okay, so kind of a medium performance PC?
Lower.
Okay, so exporting that video probably took 15 minutes?
Took a long time.
Yeah, I mean, something for a 5-minute video, right? So imagine an hour-and-a-half video. And was your source high definition? Was yours? Yes. I mean, you get the point. So exporting that in a compressed format was not something that you were experiencing in real time. So take this machine would do it in a 5-minute video. Probably could do it in I don't know, maybe 45 seconds. Probably could export something like that. But that. My MacBook Air, taking that same video, would be more like that 15 minutes for the exact same problem, just because of its computational horsepower. So the idea here is that watching raw video, even locally, isn't something we can really handle. And we're talking about super high definition stuff and things like that. So now we need to dumb this back down and go back to when we were just dealing with audio. Files are a lot smaller, but our computers back when we had vacuum tubes were also a whole lot less powerful. This i3 processor in his budget pleaser computer he was doing this on is likely, let's round down and say 5 million times more powerful than those computers that used to take up a gymnasium. And I'm actually probably being nice. It's probably 10 or 20 or 100 million times more powerful. We've come that far in technology. So we're going to take one of these machines that's the size of a gymnasium that by today's standards has no computational power, right? By then, standards back then, it was ridiculous. But by today's standards, look, I have there's a thing on my keychain that blinks sometimes. That was a supercomputer 40 years ago. Is what that was. It's a toy to me. I use it for blinking lights. What was that? What did that remind? Oh, I think I'd mentioned it one other that Tosh 2.0 thing about Survivor. He had some joke where the places that we're sending these Americans for the show Survivor are places where people really live. So you're like on these islands, and they're on the outskirts of the islands where they're filming this, but like these islands are inhabited islands, like people live there. So like you can see the film crew back in town, like he's like, look, like, this is a game to us. this is where you live. To us, this is a game. We think this is fun. Thought that was kind of entertaining. Okay, so going to music in a WAV format, which would be equivalent to raw video for audio. And, significantly smaller file sizes, but still big file sizes. Could our computers today handle raw audio fairly easily? I think it's fair to say they could. Because computers are so much faster today than they were even 10 years ago. 10 years ago, though, handling raw audio probably could still be done. But we would have a question. We could question it. Go back into the late 90s, 96, 97, 98. Raw audio was, you didn't have clips that were more than 15 seconds long, maybe, because your computer would get bogged down playing a 15-second long clip. All right, so in terms of storing music, just storing that file, well, we can replace music here with the video, storing that 20 gigabyte, hour-and-a-half movie, uncompressed movie, by today's standards we can do. 20 gigabytes of hard drive space, we're not going to bat an eye at, right? We can store a 20 gigabyte file. Sometimes our file systems are the limiting factor there, but let's just say we don't have that problem. We're running NTFS, or we're running the Mac file system, both of which can store files larger than 4 gigabytes. I think I had previously mentioned, for those of you who've ever had a USB drive, an external USB drive, and you try to put a 5 or 6 gigabyte file on there and it complains that you're out of space, it's because the file system is FAT32. Just reformat it NTFS and you can store whatever you want on there. But in any case, storing a 20 gigabyte file today is not a big deal. But our computers operate out of RAM. So when we're playing that movie, we need to read it from memory, not from hard drive, because memory is a lot faster than hard drive. Storing a 20 gigabyte file in memory today is at least plausible. There are computers, I have a Mac Pro that has 32 gigabytes of RAM in it. Why? Because I can. It's not that expensive anymore. It's just like, oh, well, it can take 32 gigabyte RAM. Let's just load it up. I didn't buy it from Apple. I did aftermarket. So instead of paying Apple $1,400 for RAM, I paid Newegg $200 for RAM and maxed it out. But at the very least, it's plausible by today's standards that we can fit a 20 gigabyte file inside of RAM. Fine. But now we need to get that data from RAM to our graphics card. How does that happen? Who takes it from RAM? RAM's a storage medium, right? And sends it to our graphics card. It's the operating system. Before we had an operating system, it was some wires hooked into whatever the equivalent of RAM is. What was the equivalent of RAM? Well, probably something based off one of these technologies. Maybe magnetic tape. What was considered the fastest storage back then when we had our vacuum tubes? Maybe our equivalent of a hard drive back then was like a dude in the corner of he was the scribe. That was long-term slow storage, and then you had one of those movie projector things, and that was the fast stuff. But the reality here is that it's a sliding scale. So what we see today is being fast is completely different than what it was back then. But we can use today's standards as it because it still works today just fine. So let's just say I have my 20 gigabyte file in memory. I got it in there. I have enough RAM. It's in memory. Moving it from the hard drive to memory took some time, but whatever. It got there. So now I'm ready to experience my movie in real time. Completely raw video. So now I need to take it out of memory at, what did I say, 6 megabytes every 60th of a second. Okay, 6 megabytes every 60th of a second. And process it. Well, let's say send it to the graphics card. And let the graphics card process it and ultimately spit it out to the screen. Well, that's a lot of data. Can our RAM do that? Can our RAM keep up with that? Well, it can come a lot closer to keeping up with that than our hard drives can. Maybe our fastest memory today could make a pretty good push at that. Okay, but you know, notice how we're degrading our confidence. Like, can we store a 20 gigabyte file on a hard drive? Yeah, no problem. Can we put it in memory? It's plausible. Can we send it from memory to a graphics card in real time? We think so. You know, now we're talking to our monitors. I mean, so you can see this is degrading real quick as we're actually getting to the point of being able to enjoy the the music, enjoy the video rather. And then when you think about a movie, there's actually two streams. One of it's the video part of it. The other one is the audio part. Okay, and even that audio can be multiply complex. You can, you know, if it's stereo audio, then you have two different streams, left and right. So now, well, it can even be more. You can have like a Dolby 5.1 encoded video or Dolby 7.1 encoded video for surround sound and stuff. That makes it even worse. So now you got to split that data that's streaming from the hard drive. Some of it is video stuff that needs to go to the graphics card. Some of it's audio stuff that needs to go to the sound card to be processed. And ultimately have it come out of the speakers and ultimately have it come out on the monitor. Synced up so that what we see is linked up to what we're hearing at the same time. So we can start seeing how raw formats can become problematic. So we think of technologies like Netflix as being it's like, oh, well, you know, this is really awesome. I can stream an entire movie over an hour, you know, an hour and a half or something like that. It took like no time to get it started. Netflix stores everything in a highly, highly compressed format, transmits it in a highly, highly compressed format, and then we internally buffer it and decompress it in real time. And who does the decompression? At the end of the day, it's probably a graphics card doing the decompression because it's faster to decompress at the hardware level than it is at the software level. So historically, we probably looked at compression as a necessity for moving data. Now, we look at compression as a necessity not just to move data, but also to experience data. Because our data is getting so complex that we can't experience it in real time uncompressed. So we rely on hardware. So we feel it's in real time, when the reality is it's probably actually buffered 30 seconds, let's say, even when you're watching a live DVD. So let's say you put a disc in your Blu-ray player and you're watching it. It's probably, unbeknownst to you, buffered something like 30 seconds because internally it's started that decoding process. You know, while you're screwing with the menu systems and stuff like that, it's getting out ahead of you. You know how there's that delay when you hit play before it actually starts up. It's actually getting the ball rolling, and let's say it's 30 seconds ahead of you for compressing this data so that it can actually give it to you, or decompressing this data, so it can actually deliver it to you in real time. What you feel is real time is actually 30 seconds ago time, something like that. So that's with today's high-tech standard or whatever. How did we pull this kind of stuff off in our early computers? Do you think we were doing video? Were we doing audio? We were doing, the audio we were probably doing is a beep, right? Somebody put a single they wired in a single circuit. What was it? It was hooked up to a bell or something like that. So you didn't even have digital beeps then. It was a bell. And when you turned a bit on to this bell, the bell went off is what happened. That was our audio. So moving data back then was a completely different animal than moving data is today, but with the exact same problems. Everything's kind of scaled. So today, our storage is done in terms of hardware registers at the fastest level. What was that equivalent of the fastest level? So not only are hardware registers the fastest, they're also the smallest little containers. Okay, it's kind of like putting something in your pocket versus storing something out in the parking lot in your car. You can get to your wallet or whatever in your pocket quickly because it's on you, it's near you. Where going out to your car is a 10-minute trek, but you can store bigger things in your car than you can fit in your pockets, right? Okay, so it's that kind of example. What do you think we did for local storage like that? Like super local storage for hardware registers? What was our equivalent of a hardware register back then? Probably another bank of vacuum tubes. Maybe we decided we had a 32-bit register. So what was that? A wall of vacuum tubes that stored 32 bits of information. Now, was that fast? Well, everything fast is relative, right? It's as fast as we're going to get back then. So we're going to store our stuff. So if you were going to have 8 hardware registers, 8 ways of storing things locally, well, you're going to need 8 banks of 32 bits, 32 vacuum tubes. There might even been a 33rd vacuum tube for the carry bit, that kind of stuff. But, regardless, lots of vacuum tubes. So now we can start seeing how these computers started filling up gymnasiums for not doing something that complex. Something the size of a car back then now fits on the tip of a pencil with integrated circuits. So, kind of amazing. So one of the things that our computers need to be able to do, we think of the computer today as kind of a CPU, but generally speaking is moving stuff from one storage medium to another storage medium, whatever those are. And we abstract those. So moving something from the hard drive is the same thing as moving something from a USB drive, even though they're based on different technologies. Our file system drivers know how to talk to a USB jump drive and know how to talk to a solid state hard drive and know how to talk to a mechanical serial ATA hard drive. We know how to work with those. So moving is moving. It's just the highway you're on that dictates how fast you can move data. Okay? Add, subtract, multiply, divide, and remainder. These are hard-coded magic tricks, even in today's standard. We talked with our vacuum tube machines that, okay, well, what do these guys look like? Well, we had, a bunch of vacuum tubes, then we had some more vacuum tubes, and we wired all these things up. We probably had some copper wire wrapped in duct tape, so that things didn't interfere with other things, and, all this crap to implement those things. Well, today we have that same version of it. It just looks cleaner. Inside of our processors, we have what used to be a math coprocessor. You go back long enough ago, actually it doesn't even have to be that long ago, probably 1994, 1995, somewhere in that ballpark. And I realize that some of you weren't born or you were extremely young then, but the point is that that's not that long ago in the big scheme of things, right? You had some of the earlier Intel processors like and actually not even that early. So you have the 386SX processor from Intel. And the big difference between the SX processor and the DX processor from Intel was that the SX did not have a math coprocessor. It didn't have math functions built into the CPU. So it needed a secondary processor, a math coprocessor, a specialized CPU that specifically knew how to do math, that the CPU talked to. So now you have 2 buildings. The building for all the other stuff, and then the building for math. And if you need math done, somebody from this building has to run over to this building and say, do some math, and bring the answer back. So even though these guys are sitting right next to each other on the motherboard, that's still slower than if they're in the same building, correct? Translating this into kind of real life. So our computers today have integrated math coprocessors. So it's part of the list of magic tricks the CPU knows how to do, but it's actually implemented in its own quadrant of the CPU, specifically for doing fast math, something you'll talk about in the senior seminar 491 class is talking about fast math. Is it 490 or 490? 490. 491 is this project class. 490 is the classroom class. Is that right? I think so. So Dr. Alakwa will teach you about...
I don't remember anything about fast math.
From 490? I'm sure you did fast multiplication. Didn't you?
Sure.
It's at least a topic you discussed.
Sure.
Isn't it?
Kind of like a very,
You glossed over it, but you talked about it as if it exists.
yeah.
All right, fine. Good enough. But in any case, you had a part of the processor specifically designed for doing just that. Kind of make sense? Well, all these things are what we talked about last time as being this minimalistic list of what does a processor, what does a computer need to be able to do for us to consider it to be a computer. And things just keep getting smaller and smaller from an integrated circuit perspective, but all the pieces remain the same. So they get smaller and smaller, they get faster and faster, but the problems still remain the same. Why? Because our data scales. Right? 10 years ago, video files had the same problems associated with them as we have with them today. Even though our data files today, our video files, have significantly higher resolution and all this stuff, because the size of the files has scaled proportionally to the speed of our hardware. 10 years ago, the problem was, I have a 400 megabyte video file as opposed to a 20 gigabyte video file. Still problematic. Make sense? Okay, so we'll come back on Friday. We'll talk a little bit more about this, and then we'll also talk about what to expect for the final exam. I'll see everybody then.